Louis Sullivan's design process. Lois H. Sullivan is one of America's greatest architects. He fathered the skyscraper and taught Frank Lloyd Wright. He was a prophet, poet, and pioneer of modern architecture, living from 1856 to 1924. Along with Frank Lloyd Wright, Henry Hobson Richardson, and Frank Furness, Sullivan is one of the four greatest American architects. There's a direct link of influence from Furness to Sullivan to Wright. Sullivan was an apprentice to Furness, and Wright was an apprentice to Sullivan.
Would you say that any of Sullivan's ideas in architecture influenced you at that time?
Naturally. They were influencing nearly everybody in the country.
How so?
He was the real radical of his day, and his thought gave us the skyscraper. See, the building was, when buildings first began to be tall, they didn't know how to make them tall. They would put one two-story or three-story building on top of another until they had enough. And I remember Liebermeister would come in and did come in and throw something on my table, the Wainwright building in St. Louis. He said, "Wright, the thing is tall. What's the matter with a tall building?" And there it was, tall. And after that, why, the skyscraper began to flourish. And I think all the skyscrapers you see today were the result of Louis Sullivan's initiative. And that was his kind of mind, his type of thought. You see, he saw the thing directly for what it was.
His greatest accomplishment was challenging the predominant theory of architectural design as copying and imitating styles. He believed copying precedent destroyed an architect's design process as a living creative art form. Architects should base their design on real forces, and in particular the building project. From this idea, Sullivan's famous phrase, "form follows function," was born. Sullivan's other great accomplishment was the invention of the skyscraper. Prior to this, architects struggled with how to design a steel-framed tall building. He was the first to give skyscrapers the form they have today. The most beautiful thing Sullivan designed was architectural ornamentation, something modernism eventually stripped from buildings. Sullivan's mastery of ornamentation is unparalleled in the history of architecture. Let's look at his design process. Sullivan's design process comes directly from his drawing technique. Drawing was the main way architects learned design in the 1800s. Although Sullivan is abstracting these techniques into design concepts, they still have a basis in drawing. Architecture and architectural drawing are inextricably linked. Sullivan's design process focused on 5 formal elements: organic form, geometric form, formal subdivision, experimentation, and engagement of the imagination. Manipulation of organic forms, or the movement method. Sullivan starts his design process with the manipulation of organic forms. He calls this morphology, like morphology in biology. This comes from a study of botany and plant forms, but also organic and intuitive expression of energy. This is like abstract expressionism in modern art. Abstraction in art starts with Plato, who believed in ideal forms. This abstraction process starts with a shape. Plato believed each physical form had an abstract or ideal form. Sullivan liberates the energy from the plant form through a process of abstraction and morphology. Form follows function for Sullivan means the form expresses the energy of the abstract concept. Today, this is called the motion method. It uses freehand and arm motion in drawing to develop a free expressive line or shape. Axes and subaxes. Sullivan uses axes and subaxes to develop form. There is always a main axis, and from it subaxes can develop. For organic form, he creates axes randomly. Sullivan gets this concept from the organic form of trees and plants. Lines function as an axis of power and containers of energy. Lines create a morphology of form. Endless variations are possible. Lines are not just lines. They function as elements of movement and energy, while also symbolically representing nature and organic processes. There is a magical quality to Sullivan's lines. He thought of them as mystical elements, much like Celtic knot design. Sullivan was Irish, so he was influenced by Celtic knot design as an interweaving of nature and number, organic and inorganic, as Sullivan says. The line becomes life. The soul is represented as a line that interweaves with the natural and inorganic worlds to become a mystical ecology.
What's the difference between organic architecture and conventional architecture?
You mean structurally, I imagine?
Yes.
Well, you see, the old post and beam construction, you can say this is the post and beam, post and beam. There's all a kind of superimposition. And if you wanted partitions, they cut and they would butt, you see, cut, butt, and slash. And if you wanted tension, you had to rivet something to something and make a connection that might give way. Well, the organic architecture brought the principles together so that a building was more like this. You see, you could pull on the structure. It had tensile strength owing to steel. And owing to steel, it could have great spaces. And the great spaces could be protected with glass. The Orientals, of course, the Greeks, never had any such facility. If they'd had steel and glass, why, we wouldn't have to do any thinking today. We'd be copying them. But now something had to be done with these new materials, these great new resources, and they are tremendous. And because of that principle of tenuity, we could use the cantilever, and into structure came this element of continuity. You see, one thing merging into another and of another, rather than this cut, butt, and slash. In other words, this same element of strength.
Axes are used as a way of constructing and representing form. It allows for the measurement of forms, the establishment of a grid, and development of proportions. This is a primary tool architects use in the design process. Frank Lloyd Wright uses axes in his ornamentation design also. It comes directly from Sullivan. Manipulation of formal geometry. Sullivan uses formal geometry, which he calls mechanical manipulation. The figure comes from plane geometry and includes squares, circles, triangles, pentagons, and other polygons. Formal geometry also has a symbolic, mystical meaning that comes from Greek philosophy and Neoplatonism. This is called sacred geometry, and architects have been using it for thousands of years, from ancient Egyptians to the Greeks and Romans to the Renaissance, from Gothic architecture to Islamic mosque design. Sullivan says, these simple forms of ancient discovery and use were given esoteric meanings and occult powers by the men of the day in an effort to control, by means of formulas and secret ritual, the destiny of man amidst the power of nature. With mystical numbers and other phenomena, they formed part of an elaborate system of magic to which the world pinned its faith. In the Middle Ages and Renaissance, formal geometry was drawn using a compass and ruler. Sullivan clearly uses this technique, but adds to it a freehand style. Sullivan uses church window design in his ornamentation. These are called trefoils and quadrifoils and are found in cathedral design from the Renaissance and Gothic period. Sullivan draws lines from the center of these forms extending out to create radiating axes of force. This creates a tension between the center and the periphery of the forms. This center-periphery concept was an important element in architectural design. It was most used in Renaissance architecture. To further this tension, he juxtaposes organic lines of force with inorganic lines. Today, this is often called constructing polygons, or the polygon method of design. What Sullivan calls parallel axes and parallelism is today called formal subdivision, or dynamic symmetry. This technique has been used for millennia by artists and architects, but Sullivan uses it as a form of creative expression, using the parallel lines to express movement, energy, and growth. It's not just a compositional tool to organize the composition, but also expresses some magical underlying current that creates the forms. Sullivan calls the experimentation he does impromptu. This comes from a drawing technique where one draws intuitively whatever comes to mind. This is like autonomous writing, but instead drawing. Often artists do gesture drawings as a way of loosening up and drawing freely. Sullivan uses this to come up with creative ideas. Experimental drawing from one's imagination is common in art and especially in comic book illustration. But Sullivan shows how this can be a great process for developing ideas and forms. This is described in The Marvel Way to Draw by Stanley and Sal Buscema. Buscema uses this technique in his comic book art, as did many other artists. Texture perspective and overlay perspective. In architecture, texture perspective makes building elements close up have more texture, and elements further away have less. This is based on the human eye's ability to see clearly close up, but loses definition as elements recede into the distance. This can be seen most clearly in the Auditorium building in Chicago. Sullivan, for this building, copied H. Richardson's Romanesque style, specifically the Marshall Field Warehouse. This was done in Richardson's personal style called Richardson Romanesque. In this building, the first floor was called the Piano Rustica, or rustic floor. Traditionally, this is the ground floor with service elements. The top floors are Piano Nobile, or noble floors. This scheme comes from Palladio and Vitruvius. Here the lower floors have much texture, and as they rise up, less and less texture is visible. Overlay perspective, as I call it, is where one form is overlaid over another. This creates the illusion that one element is closer and the other further away. Sullivan uses this continually to give depth to his ornament. Even though it is low relief sculpture, his ornament looks very three-dimensional.
We are the music makers, and we are the dreamers of dreams.
Architects must have a theory of what makes a good building and good spaces for people to inhabit. Sullivan was trying to invent a purely American architecture and used American ideas. Architects of the time were trying to reconcile the amazing technologies and advancements of modern industrial materials and processes with the human-centered world of art, craft, and beauty. In Sullivan's theory, people have a body and a spirit. People are both organic and inorganic. The power of the human ego is like a seed. It grows, creating the world through an act of creativity. Human beings have a will to express the internal powers of their ego or soul. Society should be created as fertile ground to grow and express the ego, not subjugate it. So what are the powers of man that Sullivan believed in? He lists 5 main powers of man: the physical, intellectual, emotional, moral, and spiritual. Physical powers are body growth, conservation, muscular control, and locomotion, the power to do things, affect changes, and to create situations. The intellectual group of powers starts with curiosity and ends in highly sophisticated manipulation. These are the powers of observation, of memory, reflection, and reasoning. By reasoning, we mean the construction of diagrams and models to satisfy one's craving for orderly form. The emotional group of powers embraces every power of feeling. This is the basis of action, especially spectacular action. It is of instinct. Although the power of intellect has today become a fetish, emotion is the one that has power to move the people of the world. The great stabilizing power. The central power of man is free will and choice. Shall man be tyrannized by fate, or shall he assert his freedom and integrity, creating and controlling his destiny? Man's spirit liberates and organizes his instinctive powers. His intellect has held them in bondage. He must recognize the truth that fate and destiny lies within himself. Choice is the most potent of his moral powers. The spiritual power in man functions as a superquality, clarifying vision. A prophet is a dreamer of dreams, a man in a dream that is within a greater dream of life. Man dreams of spirit, and spirit dreams of life. Man's dream dispels fear as he dreams of his powers, physical, intellectual, emotional, moral, and spiritual. Within this power, man awakens from the dream. An architect must express these 5 powers in their work. But more than this, an architect must give people who inhabit spaces they create the freedom to express these powers themselves in all they do. Architects must give people freedom to actively inhabit a space. Architects must give people intellectual freedom to understand where they are going, and where they have been. The power of memory and imagination to be able to envision a space and to live in it. Architects must elicit an emotional response in people. People want beauty and meaning in their lives, and architecture should give it to them. Architects must be moral and create good places for people to live. Lastly, architects must provide a spiritual experience for people so they can have meaning in their lives. Good architecture allows people to have freedom and exercise their intrinsic powers of free choice. Society should be a fertile ground to grow and express the powers of the ego and the spirit, not to subjugate it. Bad environments limit people's free choice and turn them into subjects. Time hasn't been kind to Sullivan's architecture. During the post-war era of urban renewal, many of Sullivan's buildings were demolished. His Garrick Theater in Chicago was destroyed in the 1960s. Dooley Block in Salt Lake City was demolished. The Bayard Building in New York was destroyed. Real estate values and parking lots destroyed Sullivan's works and the architectural history of the United States. The World Columbian Exhibition, the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, helped to destroy Sullivan's career. The exposition was designed in the neoclassical style of the Beaux-Arts. McKim, Mead & White designed the Agricultural Building. Richard Morris Hunt designed the Administration Building. Sullivan designed the Transportation Building and was the only building not in the neoclassical style. Frank Lloyd Wright later wrote, "By this overwhelming rise of grandomania, I was confirmed in my fear that a native architecture would be set back at least 50 years. Wright was correct. This architecture destroyed American native architecture and instead produced a fake Eurocentric style. Sullivan's romantic modernism instantly fell out of style, and the fake neoclassical style prevailed. When one thinks of a bank, no one thinks of Sullivan's bank buildings, but instead a Greek temple. Due to the panic of 1893, the firm of Adler and Sullivan was dissolved, and Sullivan went into a 20-year-long financial decline. He eventually became an alcoholic. His wife left him, and he died homeless in a Chicago hotel room in 1924. We can still learn from Sullivan's design process. We should also remember Sullivan's theories and deep humanism. He teaches us that architecture is a vehicle to express human creative powers. It's time to bring back deep humanism to architecture. I'm Jamie Roberts. If you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe.